Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Carrie, and the topic of today's webinar is executive function and early learning. And we're really excited. We have Dr. Rebecca Rolland here with us today, and she'll be presenting for you today, and just very exciting to have everybody joining us today. And again, we'll get started in about 5 minutes from now. I want to give everybody enough time to join us today and get situated and get, with us today. And here at Scientific Learning, for the first time, we are partnering with Kiko Labs to get the word out about the importance of executive function skills in our early learners. We're just very excited to have Dr. Rolland with us here today, and we'll get started in about 4 minutes from now. Very exciting to have you all here today, and great, we have our Canadian friends are well represented here. Very exciting to have you all joining us. I always love to hear where people are writing in from. I'm personally in Northern California. I know we have folks joining us from all different places. I know also that we have some folks from Australia that might be joining us, from New Zealand, Singapore, Asia, all around Asia. So just very exciting. This webinar definitely got publicized from around the world. So very, very exciting. So definitely want to welcome you all as you join us today. Very exciting to see our Canadian friends here. I am getting a word that the sound is echoing. Usually the only time it echoes is when you have two browser windows open. So make sure you only have one browser window open, even if that means you have to close down the webinar and come back in. Close down your browser completely and come back in. That's normally when that happens. We are going to get started in about 5 minutes from now. Someone is writing in from Trinidad. Oh, welcome, welcome, welcome. Very exciting. It's really cool. So is the webinar starting at 10 a.m.? Depends on what time zone you're on. Depends on what time zone. It is 1 p.m. Pacific. I think it is, isn't it? Are we on daylight savings time now? I think it is. So it is 1 p.m. Pacific time right now, and that could be any number of time zones, both in the U.S. and around the world. So is there video or just sound? We're going to be doing audio and presentation slides for you today, and that's what that's going to consist of. Again, we'll get started in about another 3, 4, 5 minutes from now. I just want to get everybody enough time to get situated. It's 4 p.m. Eastern time, yes, correct, and 1 p.m. Pacific. I know that if you're joining us from other countries, it's going to be all sorts of times. And I know that this webinar was marketed worldwide. We have partners all around the world who will be joining us. Oh, it's 10 a.m. in New Zealand. So welcome to our New Zealand friends who are joining us. Very exciting. I was thinking 10 a.m. would be Hawaiian time, but I don't think Hawaiians are on. I don't think Hawaii's on 3 hours behind us right now. I think they're only 2 hours behind us right now. So again, we'll get started in just a few minutes from now. We're doing a last couple of touches here on the webinar. And again, we'll get started in just a few minutes. No, you won't see what other people are typing. I just got asked that question. It's more of a presenter interface where you're going to see all the different resources that are available, and you'll be able to download things and look at articles that we posted. And just a couple of things before we do get started today. There are a bunch of widgets at the bottom of your screen, and you can refer to those throughout the session today. And I'll just go through a couple of those widgets right now. There's a bright yellow widget on the left-hand side of your screen that has a question mark in it. That is your help menu. You then have a blue slide little button, and you can open your slides and adjust those accordingly. The red button is a media player, which just basically takes care of your audio. There's a purple QA window, and that's how you can talk to me throughout the session if you want, or ask questions. The blue icon is your speaker bio, more information about her. There's a resource list. What we put there is a handout of the presentation slides as a PDF file. We have an article by Dr. Rolland as well from USA Today that we put in there. We also put in a article about executive function, a link to another article And then we also have information about Kiko's thinking time as well, and you'll hear more about that later on in the session. Oh, hello from Australia. Well, welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining. Very exciting, all these places from around the world, and it's just very exciting to think that I can be here in Northern California and have folks from Australia. We have someone else joining in. It's 7 a.m. in Queensland, Australia right now, and again, we'll get started in about another minute or two. So this is just really cool. I love how technology can bring us all together and we can have these types of webinars. Because you figure, oh, we've got more folks from New Zealand signing in. So again, we're going to get started in about another minute or two. And again, the bottom of your screen is very interactive. You have a bunch of resources. Oh, right, if you want a certificate of attendance, so we do get a lot of those questions about certificates of attendance. We do ask that you watch the webinar for 45 minutes. Once you do that, it will track your progress and it will allow you to download the certificate of attendance. So feel free to do that as well. Now we have some folks from, let's see here, Texas, and then who else? New Jersey, very exciting. So it's great to see how many people are coming in from various places, either from the US, Canada, around the world. We have over 100 people with us right now, which is very exciting also. We have another person from Virginia. And again, we're going to get started in about another minute or two. And very exciting. Oh, great. Ohio, very exciting. I know our presenter is on the East Coast. Do we have any East Coast people joining us? I have a fond place in my heart for New England. I actually grew up in upstate New York and grew up in Maine and lived in Boston for a time. And just very exciting. We got Florida. We've got, let's see here. Oh, very nice. In Fairbanks. Oh, Charlotte. Well, welcome. Welcome, welcome. Charlotte in Fairbanks. She's visiting in Seattle. Very exciting. With Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Philadelphia. Yes, you can access the resource list at a later date. Definitely, definitely, definitely. From Sydney, Australia. Welcome. Baltimore, Maryland. How long until the presentation starts? I'm going to stop yapping shortly. Just waiting for one last thing to be handled here, and we will get started momentarily. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is just go over again a couple more housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. You can use your Join Now button in about an hour and a half from now to access the recording, so keep that in mind. We will also be sending out a thank you for attending or we missed you email in the next 24 to 48 hours, so be on the lookout for that email. Sometimes that ends up in your spam box or junk box, so definitely be on the lookout for that email that'll be coming. You can see this presentation more than one time, not to worry if you have to leave or you have to, you want to see it again. It's going to be some great information in here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce your presenter to you today. We're very excited to have her here with us today, Dr. Rebecca Rowland. She currently teaches on the faculty at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is an oral and written language specialist in the Neurology Department of Children's Hospital in Boston, where she works as part of an interdisciplinary team to diagnose children with learning disabilities and provide recommendations for parents and schools. She served as an academic learning specialist at Kingsley Montessori School and as the project coordinator for the Rigorous and Regulated Learning Environment Project. As a nationally certified speech-language pathologist, she has worked clinically with populations ranging from early childhood through high school and provided teacher professional development. She has an EDD from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and an MS in speech-language pathology from MGH Institute of Health Professions. Please help me welcome Dr. Rowland.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you, and I'm excited to hear how many different places people are from. I'm actually in Boston right now, and so on the East Coast, welcoming all those people, as well as everyone else from Australia and beyond. So let's go ahead and get started. This is a really exciting topic for me and very close to my heart. Since the more I've worked with early childhood, the more I've realized just how critical and key these skills are for building knowledge. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the research that's going on and some of the new types of options we have for building executive function. So I'd really like to talk both about the theory, but then also about some action steps you can take either in your classrooms or your schools to build executive function. So before I talk more about that, I'd like to get a sense of where everyone is coming from in terms of their interest. So I'd like to ask you to take just a moment to answer one poll question, which is, what is your primary role or interest with students in terms of their executive function skills? So are you a teacher or aide or specialist who works directly with young students? Are you an administrator or are you a parent? So if you could just take a moment to answer that question, and then we'll all take a look at the poll results together. All right, so it looks so far like 50% of our respondents work directly with young students, 24% administrators, 20% work in a private setting, and 6% a parent of a child with issues. So great. That looks like it's a great range because we're going to talk some about actual classroom applications, which will be great for those of you who work directly with students. We'll also talk about just building executive function at the school level as well, which will be helpful for the administrator. And a lot of these tips are things that you can definitely do, whether you work in a private setting, one-on-one with students, or if you're actually a parent of a child. So this will be really helpful in sort of covering each of those grounds. So as we get started, let's take a look at what executive function actually is. So it actually sounds like a very complex thing, and it is very complex, but we see it all the time in classrooms. So if we just take one basic classroom example, we're going to think about 3 kindergartners participating at circle time. So we have 2 students, Abby and James, and they are focusing on the discussion, and they raise their hands to answer the teacher's question. So everything is going well for them. However, there's another student, Michael, and he's very distracted, he's interrupting, and he has a hard time remembering what to do. You may know one or more of these kinds of students in your classroom who really struggle, whether it's to sit still, to stay on task, or to maintain their focus. And already it's pretty clear which of these children will be more successful at the learning activity. And latest research actually links this ability with executive function skills. So we see this as kind of a foundational skill, not just actually doing the activity or learning, but almost building the foundation in order for children to learn. And if we don't have those skills, or if those skills are weaker, it's that much harder for children to actually learn. So then thinking more about what is executive function. And actually, let's see, one moment while there's something going on with my slides. Let me just fix this. So actually, when we think about executive function, we can really think about the front part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain really deals a lot with managing, planning, and organizing. So if that part of the brain isn't working as well, then children can definitely struggle in terms of actually managing their ability to plan, to inhibit their action, so they often have trouble with their impulse control, or to switch from one thing to the next. So if we think about executive function, we can make an analogy about country roads and highways. So here, we can think about that as children are getting older and growing, their neural pathways started out very small, so almost as if a country road that's very small and unpaved. But as they get older and as they develop these skills, these country roads start to develop. So they get faster, they get more connected, and things move smoother. So information actually moves more smoothly through these connections. So we think about moving from country roads where things are winding and take a while to highways where there's sort of a super, much quicker pathway of information to speed through. And that's what we try to help children get to. So we actually try to help along their executive function so they're able to move to that sort of highway analogy rather than the country roads. And then we think about what is executive function. So actually, how do we define this process? And actually, we think about it as several things. It's not just one thing. And children can actually have deficits in multiple areas of executive function or just in one area. So the best analogy that researchers have thought of is really what's called the air traffic control system for the brain. So in this way, students are actually having to use executive function to plan, to focus their attention, to remember instructions, and to juggle multiple tasks. So just as an air traffic controller really needs to figure out which planes are coming in, which are coming out, and how to actually manage that process, so too does a brain actually have to plan and organize and think ahead. So if that doesn't happen, obviously for an air traffic controller, real disasters can happen. But for our brains, we don't see those same disasters, but we see similarly children having trouble with these skills. So having trouble planning ahead, having trouble focusing on the teacher or on their lesson, and having trouble remembering. So this actually, we consider these really the building blocks of learning. And this is one of the most important skills, but also one of the most challenging skills for early childhood. So why is executive function so important? Well, we know this for a couple of reasons. And looking at the research, there's actually some startling facts and findings that have come out. So for instance, children with stronger working memory, inhibition, and attention skills, so these are all elements of executive function, have been found to make larger gains on tests of early math, language, and literacy. So not only are they learning well, but they're actually learning at a faster and stronger rate than students who have weaker skills in that area. And that really goes back to that earlier slide of the classroom, where we think about students who are able to attend, who are able to switch from one thing to the other. They're actually more available for learning than students without those skills. So it's already a struggle for students with executive function deficits just simply to sit and attend. And so actually learning becomes even more challenging. Something else that we've realized is that, as in the second bullet there, working memory and attention skills for students from lower income backgrounds, so low SES children, at the beginning of preschool predicts achievement more so than math and reading ability. So this is really a startling finding in a way, because it shows us that not only does reading achievement predict later reading achievement, which seems more obvious, but these foundational skills are actually more predictive than math and reading ability. So really these skills are sort of underlying everything we think about when we consider early learning. So in terms of cognitive skills in the classroom, this is just a table showing you the different elements of executive function, what these elements show, and then what potential issues can come up. So there's these three buckets here. And as we see, the first bucket being working memory. And this is really the ability to follow multi-step directions, to understand stories, and generally the ability to hold and manipulate information. So it's not just short-term memory, which is just holding information, but it's really holding information so that you can do something with it. However, there are issues with this. So if students have trouble with working memory, they might get lost when given multiple instructions. So a classic example of this is if a student is asked, please go hang up your jacket, put your lunch in your cubby, and wash your hands. So generally, this is a problem for students if they're not able to do more of those things. When you look at the next slide, you see some other skills and what they do. So things like relational reasoning, the ability to recognize patterns and draw connections. And this is really critical, not just for math, but for any kind of reasoning. And children who have trouble with this actually are slow to recognize patterns and can't reproduce a pattern once it's shown. So as we see, executive function skills start developing in the preschool years. So there's a graph here which shows you how rapidly actually executive function skills develop in the ages around 3 to 6 years old. So we see it ramping up slightly even from birth, but then there's this period and almost a window of executive function skill development where we can really target and really focus our attention. So in terms of a healthy development of skills, this table is really just to show you the typical development of skills starting at 1 year, 2 to 3 years, and 4 to 5 years. And the overall point here is that executive function skills develop over time. So they're not simply something that pops up at 4 to 5 years and wasn't there before. It's something that's being built from birth and is gradually becoming stronger and stronger as children age. And so here, even in terms of cognitive flexibility, this is the ability to shift and be flexible in terms of focusing on tasks. And we see that a 4 to 5 year old child can succeed at changing actions based on changing roles. So a child might take their shoes off at home and keep them on at school, or vice versa. So they understand that in this setting, I must do this, whereas in another setting, I should do something else. So I want to take another moment for a poll and to think about what one executive function skill you think your students can improve most. And if you work directly with students, this will be maybe an easier question to answer. If you're an administrator, I'd like you to think about the students who are in your classrooms and what the teachers struggle with or what they mention in terms of challenges. All right, so it looks like the majority say inhibitory control. So if they could control their impulses, they could learn so much more. 25% working memory, and then cognitive flexibility, 17%. Great, so, and I agree with this. So I have, in terms of my own practice, I've seen all of these being challenges, but something that's most striking to me has been inhibitory control. So waiting for children who can't bear to not shout out answers, for example, who have trouble raising their hands, who have trouble waiting before directions are given and things like that. And that's something that's very, very common in preschool and also common for students as they grow up if they're having challenges in this area. And that obviously can make it very challenging to teach if you have a lot of students with challenges in this area. So this is something that we can really try to target and work on to help make classrooms easier places to learn and then help students with these skills as well. So what do we know about executive function skills and poverty? Well, we definitely know that executive function skills are impacted by poverty. Children with poorer backgrounds are more likely to have lower executive function skills. So this has been a big source of research in the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard. And this is a place where Dr. Jack Shonkoff has done a lot of work. And he talks about this idea of toxic stress, almost as though enough stress, when it's chronic enough, can be a pollutant in a way to children's brains. So this is actually hurting children in the sense that it's dampening their executive function skills and putting them in a constant state of fight or flight. So if a child is constantly stressed, whether it's by poverty, by frequent moves, by instability in their home, they're constantly in a state of heightened anxiety and stress. And this is really impacting their ability to learn. One moment while I see about this, trying to move to the next slide here. Okay, there we go. So toxic stress, we know, also causes a negative spiral for executive function skills. So we know that when children struggle with toxic stress or are impacted by toxic stress, they're less available for learning. So that's sort of the first thing that happens, is that they're worried, they're in this fight or flight state, and actually concentrating on academics or actually concentrating on playing with peers or learning from peers becomes very challenging. At the same time, teachers are reacting more negatively. So when the students are perhaps not behaving appropriately or not able to attend, the teachers are then giving negative feedback because naturally they are trying to bring their classrooms back to being well-managed places. And then children sometimes are taken out of the classroom when their behavior or their actions become extreme enough, and then they have fewer opportunities to learn. So this can actually be a cycle that repeats itself in a negative fashion and makes it very difficult both for students to learn and also for teachers to manage their classrooms. Then we can see, on the other hand, how executive function skills can link to academic success. So we saw this negative spiral happening before with toxic stress, and now we can think about how strong executive function skills actually create a positive cycle for children. So rather than this cycle of negative feedback, being reprimanded or taken out of class, we see that these strong skills can be seen as a building block underlying success. And with these stronger executive function skills, children are better able to attend to and benefit from instruction. They're more available for learning. They're actually more able to switch from one activity to the other when a teacher says, oh, now we're moving from circle time to choice time, or now we're going to the block area. They're actually able to do that in a way that isn't disruptive, in a way that promotes their own learning and their peers' learning. And then as a result, naturally, these children are receiving more positive feedback from teachers. And not only from teachers, but also from their peers. And what we know from the research is that teacher feedback is very critical, and so is peer feedback. So early on, children are understanding if they're accepted or how well they're accepted by the group. So actually being accepted and being praised by peers and by teachers is a critical factor in learning as well. What we also know is that executive function skills strongly predict academic success. So the idea here is that it's not that executive function skills are academic skills, but that they actually support the how of learning in order to help children master the what. So in this sense, in order to help children master content, they're actually supporting them to understand, how do I do that? How do I learn in a way that's effective? How do I sit still? How do I attend? And so ironically, it predicts not only school performance, but even occupational success in later years. So we know not only how well a child does academically, but even how well they'll function at their job is predicted by executive function skills. And this makes sense in a way because, as you see, even as adults, we're constantly bombarded with the need for executive function skills. So we need to have impulse control, strong working memory, strong attentional skills. And the need for this even grows greater as we get older. So what do we know about building executive function skills? Well, we know that there are many ways to build them. So this is just going to be a window in some ways into some options. So, and there's been several great studies. So one came from Adele Diamond in 2012, and she really reviewed the evidence for different ways to build executive function skills. And what she found was that the best evidence was for computer-based training, martial arts, and 2 curricula, which I'll go into in greater detail in the later slides. She found that there was some evidence for yoga, mindfulness training, and some other curricula. So this idea of settling the mind, of settling the body, and of being present, these types of curricula do have some evidence for improving executive function skills. One important thing to note is that in all of these programs, students need to be progressively challenged, meaning that they actually need to have harder and harder tasks as they become better at these skills. So if a task actually remains the same and remains equally challenging, once a student improves at that task, they're not likely to get much more gain out of it. So it actually needs to become progressively more challenging to stretch students' skills in order for them to make gains. So what does research on interventions show us? So first, just like this idea of toxic stress, we know that executive function skills suffer when children are generally not doing well. So if children are under stress, if they're upset, or if they're not physically fit, their executive function skills and their ability to build these skills actually suffers. So obviously, a child's mental and physical and cognitive well-being are very, very closely intertwined. So if one of these areas is suffering, a child's not likely to become stronger in the other areas. On the other hand, when a child's social, emotional, and physical needs are met, they're better able to show their strong executive function skills and think creatively. So just as for adults, we know that if we're very exhausted, if we're stressed by some recent news, it's very hard for us to be creative and to fully express who we are. And the same goes for children. However, interventions can really work on targeting these areas. So we know that not only targeting the brain, but targeting the body, targeting all of these areas can also support executive function skills. So what do we know about executive function interventions specifically? So there's several curricula that have shown promising effects on children's development of skills. One of these is called Tools of the Mind. And you can look up more information about this curricula online. It has a lot of exciting parts to it, and it really teaches teachers how to organize and manage instruction to help students build what's called self-regulation skills. So it does this a lot through literacy development. So there are fairy tales, there are chapter books, and intentional pretend play, meaning that teachers are really helping children to organize their play and organize their interactions in a way that supports executive function skills. So in terms of this program, there was a randomized control trial, which is sort of seen as the gold standard of research, which found positive effects on kindergarten children's executive function and attention and their stress responses. This was definitely for kindergarten, as there's been some prior studies on tools of the mind for pre-kindergarten students, and those have shown mixed results. And here, obviously, there's a lot of teacher training involved. So in this particular study, teachers were trained in a 2-year cycle. We also know that there are positive effects on 2 other curricular add-ons. So one called Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies, or PATS, and the Chicago School Readiness Project. And these programs are thought to help level the executive function playing field, which means to support young children at the very early stages, so we don't see these drastic differences based on socioeconomic status. However, one negative about these programs is that they are very time and resource intensive. So they're really targeting more like whole schools through curricula that are more comprehensive. And while these can have shown to have some positive effects, there are, as we saw with the 2-year training, they can be resource intensive as well. So let's take a look at just how we would actually bridge interventions to the classroom. I know many of you talked about being teachers working with children directly or working in private practice. We want to think about what can we actually do to support students. And what we know here's a little table with interventions, benefits, and then limitations. And we have several interventions listed here, so ranging from martial arts, which actually has a strong evidence of impact, but limitations requires a trained coach and is more of an after-school activity. So most teachers aren't necessarily able to implement martial arts programs in their classrooms, although maybe you could do some of those. Yoga and mindfulness training is something that's more implementable as a teacher and shows medium evidence of impact. However, some aspects of yoga and mindfulness are more targeted to children who are over 8. So things like becoming present, some types of meditation and things like that are not as easily implementable for young children. In terms of executive function related curricula, so there is definitely a range. We found medium to strong evidence in the research. However, teacher training can be expensive and it can be time consuming to implement. Finally, computer-based training. So here, there's been a range of research studies on different programs, and there's strong evidence for some and not as strong evidence for others. The good benefits of these, or the good things about these, is that they're easily incorporated into a class. So these are things that involve iPads or other computer-based products, and there's not much teacher training needed. However, in terms of the limitations, really the efficacy needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So not all computer-based programs are created equally, and really more research needs to be done to ensure the efficacy of all of these programs. And also, obviously, for younger kids, we do want to have some screen time limits and not have children on the computer all the time. So thinking about how to actually make a mix of these interventions, how to draw from these interventions to support children, it can be very critical. So let's take one moment for a last poll. And the question here is, how effective do you feel your methods are working to build executive function skills now? So this would be, how are they doing in terms of working directly with children, or how do you think your teachers are doing in addressing them? And so think about, are you actually addressing them, or do you think it's working, and whether you potentially target them methodically. All right, so everyone was quick on that one. So the majority seems, I'm not sure I'm actually addressing them at all. Okay, and that's very typical. So that's not anything to be worried about. It's something definitely to start thinking about in your practice. Some 18% say, I think what I'm doing is working okay, and then 13% I target these skills directly and methodically. And that's great to see as well. So what we know actually from the research is that this is a very typical profile of teachers and administrators. So a lot of people feel, I'm not actually sure if I'm doing this at all, or that it's maybe doing it somewhat, but it can be challenging to do. So I think all teachers and all parents as well, we do some of these things indirectly. So we do try to help children manage their attention. We do try to help them with inhibition. However, sometimes we can feel like these things are more effective. Sometimes we can feel like they're less effective. So we'll talk in the next few minutes about what's called neuroscience-based technology as one idea of how to start building these skills. So this is neuroscience-based technology. It's really thinking about technology based on what we know about the brain. And what we've seen in the research is that computerized training programs have shown benefits in multiple areas of executive function. For example, working memory and attention. There have been some research studies on that. Inhibition, selective attention, flexibility, and reasoning. So each of these skills have been targeted and have been shown to have improved with certain computer programs. The other nice thing about these programs is that, as we see with a lot of education these days, is there's a lot of ability to personalize. So we can adapt to the individual. These types of programs can differentiate. So rather than saying everyone needs to do this type of skill set or work on skills in this type of way, programs can actually adapt to children's levels. There can also be tracking and measuring. So parents and teachers frequently now have a much more interest in tracking and using data for assessment purposes and also for instructional purposes. And the nice thing about some of these programs is they can actually have recordable data that then can be used either to show to parents or to plan for instruction. So I'll just talk a little bit about Kiko's Thinking Time, which is one of the partners of Scientific Learning. And this is a program that has been recently being researched, and it's designed to promote executive function, reasoning, and spatial skills for children ages 3 to 7. So it was developed with support from the U.S. Department of Education, and it involves 20 game-based progressive exercises based on neuropsychological tasks. So these are things like switching, attention, flexibility, working memory, and skills like that. And it's available on a wide range of browsers, so Android, desktop, all of those. And I want to take a look at how does the research behind the product look so far. So far, the research has been independently conducted by WestEd, which is a not-for-profit education research agency. And this is nice to see because we like to see that studies are done not only by the company themselves, but actually by someone else who can be more objective at times. The product has been tested in schools for usability. And as you see here from some of the data, there has been a pilot study done, meaning an initial study, showing that product usage in classrooms over 2 weeks led to an increase of 4.6 months in reasoning skills. And the measurement here was from a standardized cognitive assessment. So the WITSE matrix reasoning subtest, which is really part of a subtest used in assessing cognitive skills generally. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, we just have some screenshots here. And so this would be a working memory sequence. And children are instructed to watch the apples and tap them in the order of small to big. They need to actually watch them, remember what's happening, and then tap them in the correct order. And this can be very challenging for some children and not so challenging for others. And what's nice is that children who are doing better in this or who struggle less, it becomes harder for them. So there's actually this sense of progressive challenge. And so here's another shot just so you see what the apples would look like and how the screen would look to the children. So what's also nice about this thinking time is that it actually shows, based on each student, the performance in an age group, or the performance based on age group. So here you'll see one sample student, Brittany Lopez, and how the student compares based on the age group. And there's a visual as well. So you can see, okay, the student is stronger in, for example, reasoning, but it struggles more with working memory. So this really allows you to share with parents and also with teachers how things are working, and also what more could be done. So in general, this is just one idea of working on executive function, but it's something that is definitely in the works now in terms of research, and something that's very exciting, just thinking about personalizing learning, being progressively challenging, and actually challenging children to develop these skills. So I'd like to stop there for one moment and see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, there are several questions that have come in, and I want to start back on a question that came in while you were presenting a little bit earlier on. Do you find boys have more trouble with executive function skills than girls, or is that more of a stereotype?
No, so actually we do know that in several areas, including some aspects of executive function, boys do tend to develop later. So I wouldn't say that boys generally have more trouble with them, but that the range that they develop slightly later, some of the research shows. So that may be where that difference is seeming. Also, I think some of the classroom, expectations we started to see favor what girls sort of favor quieter boys or girls who sit still longer. So there's been a lot of research done recently into thinking about how classrooms can change to allow for a wider range of learning styles.
Okay, so next question is, can Kiko's thinking tools be used with older children? And there was another question about what can we do with older children? Any thoughts on that?
So, yeah, so this Kiko is designed for ages 3 to 7. I think it probably could be used for children at the high end of that range or slightly higher, but the design of it is such that probably children who are much older than that would not find it very challenging after a certain point. So it could be used, but might not be the kind of progressive challenge that they would be looking for. It's really more for the young children in early childhood. In terms of older students, when we go back to one of those slides, in terms of other programs that show different levels of efficacy, let me see if I can pull that up.
Okay.
Let's see. So we know that, for instance, yoga and martial arts training show medium evidence for yoga and strong evidence for martial arts. So for these things, these are actually training children not only cognitively but physically to bring together many of these aspects. So some of these things are definitely involving more of a coach rather than something you can do quickly at a computer. So we really need to also think about what computer-based training exists for older children. And as far as I know, there's not a lot out there, but I can definitely look into it and post more resources as well.
Wonderful. And another question we got, which is really good. It's interesting to have listened to your presentation today. Why do you think most of us don't know how to target these skills, these executive function skills? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's definitely a good question. I think partly is because it's really a term that it's hard to sort of get a handle on. So we learn a lot about behavior We learn a lot about sort of targeting early learning, early literacy. And only recently have we started to realize how foundational these skills actually are. Another reason is that it's very hard to know how to do this in the moment. So when there's a lot going on in a classroom, so we have children who are struggling to wait to raise their hand, children who are calling out, children who are distracted, it can feel just like an overwhelming problem. So rather than becoming proactive and thinking about how do we actually train executive function skills, it's very easy, and this has happened to me as well, for sure, to get in sort of this putting out fires mode of just, okay, I need to fix this behavior, I need to help this student with this, I need to try to redirect the student. And so in that way, we're not necessarily training these skills proactively, we're just managing their effects. And so I think that actually teacher training programs have really not emphasized proactively supporting these skills.
Wonderful. And here's a really good question. A lot of these skills can also be affected by learning challenges such as dyslexia, ADHD. Is it that we wait for the 3 to 5 year window of development before we start thinking about recommending an assessment?
Do you mean for the other areas in terms of learning or in terms of executive function?
I'm thinking in terms of the executive function.
No, I mean, I would definitely never, just because I'm in the field of assessment myself, I would never suggest waiting for an assessment. I think that if you're concerned as a parent or a teacher, I think obviously you want to try some things first to see how significant is the problem. So do provide some scaffolding first. Try to see what happens if we, for instance, with executive function, what happens if we provide a student with a chair they could sit in, rather than sitting on the floor? What happens if we give them a cue to respond first before having them shout out? So sort of trying some in the classroom types of interventions first, I think, is always a good step. If a parent or a teacher is still really concerned, I would still recommend looking into assessment, because I think, as we know, early childhood is a really critical period for building these skills and also for building learning skills. So if there's a challenge, it can really be very critical to get it addressed early.
And here's an interesting question that just came in. Is there a difference in executive function skills if you take a look at public versus private school children, owing to teacher-student ratio and other resource differences?
That's a really good question. So I would assume that so that's a good question, but my answer would actually be a little bit different than that. I think there's definitely a difference, but I would say most likely based on socioeconomic status. Because what we know from obviously private school children and just the private school resources, they're much more frequently coming from higher socioeconomic status. And because we know that children from lower SES backgrounds struggle more with executive function or tend to, then that seems that would be already more of an issue in public schools. At the same time, the facts that you mentioned, so the fact of having lower ratios, for having more individualized attention, that's obviously further supporting children's executive function skills. So in a way, it's sort of a double whammy, in the sense that children from low SES backgrounds are already probably struggling more, and then they're probably also receiving less support at times for those. So I would say both.
Okay. And then the next question is, and I want the person to clarify this question for me, but the question is, what is the assessment measuring in pre and post testing? Okay, so I get the question. So basically, what are you measuring if you're doing pre and post testing?
In terms of that specific study that we looked at? Is that
I think so.
What you were thinking? Yes. So that was, we can go back to that. That was called matrix reasoning, which is one element of a reasoning task. It's more of a visual reasoning task. And so that was what was shown to have changed, which makes sense because a lot of the Kiko Lab's actual tasks are very visual and involve sort of visual reasoning and visual thinking.
Okay. The next question, actually, this is really good. How do we know if a child is in the typical range of development? because we do see poor control is to be expected for young children, possibly. So how do we know, how do we differentiate between a normal child and a child who is struggling with executive function skills? Like, is there a way to kind of gauge that?
Sure. So there are some measures of that in terms of the actual assessments. So there are assessments looking at what are called criterion-based measures. So actually, this is basically checking boxes from parents and teachers. Do you see your child doing these things? How often is this a problem, et cetera, et cetera? So there are measures like that. There are also measures that are more briefer but are more used for research purposes. So things like the pencil tap test, where you say, I'm tapping twice, then you tap once, I tap once, you tap twice, et cetera. Those are more for research purposes. Really what the best way would really be, honestly, observation and thinking about how far delayed are they as compared to peers. So at this age, there's not really a very, very strong measure of, okay, your executive function skills are at X level. It's much more in terms of how much is this interfering with the classroom, how much is it supporting a child or not supporting a child to function in the classroom and to learn. And if this is clearly interfering, then that's a time for concern.
Okay, that's a really good answer to that. Is there a tool that schools could use to screen young children to measure executive function skills? Is there anything you'd recommend?
So that's a good question, because actually that's exactly what I've been thinking with Kiko Labs about developing an intervention like this. We don't have a lot of things. There are a few that measure only just one aspect of executive function quickly. The challenge with a lot of these measures actually is that mostly they're done by neuropsychologists in private settings. So there aren't a lot of screening tools actually for early childhood executive function, and that's something that the research is moving towards right now, actually. Because I agree, I think that would be a very critical thing to have.
Okay, and someone's asking me about the BRIEF test, and it's capitalized, BRIEF test.
Yes.
Is that reliable for executive function skills?
Yeah, so we definitely use that. So that's something that we look at for executive function. Also for, we also look at that when we're thinking about, is there an issue with ADD? Is there something like that? But yes, we're considering that's definitely more a questionnaire for parents and teachers, more for ages 5 through 18. And it's really designed to assess, I use it actually in my own, I don't actually give it, but at Children's Hospital, we use that as well. Thinking about a child or behavior or an adolescent's behavior. And it's actually used as part of an ADHD diagnosis as well.
Great. Okay, here's a really fascinating question. Has there been a correlation between the number of ACEs experienced in childhood and lower executive function skills? So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. This is really when we think about this idea of toxic stress, that goes very much along with that. So toxic stress is really thinking about these multiple adverse experiences piled up in the sense that they're constant and there's sort of this unremitting feeling of a child really being not simply having one adverse experience and having trauma. We do know that trauma also impacts executive function skills and very much impacts learning as well. So even one traumatic event could impact this, but definitely in terms of this idea of toxic stress, a series of events where there's sort of a sense of instability or a feeling of heightened anxiety because the child doesn't know what's coming next. That can really make it difficult to be available in the classroom and definitely difficult to learn.
Okay, so that was a great question, and thank you so much for that answer to that one. The next question is a more practical question. Can you use Kikos on a desktop computer?
Yes, so that is definitely, that's possible. It can be used on a desktop or on an iPad. If you look at, let's see, go back to that. Let's see. That's towards the end, but that, yes, it can definitely be used on a desktop.
Okay, and there's another question.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say,
Oh, you go.
in terms of the ease of use, that's why the iPad has been used more frequently, just because it's hard, I think, to move children in and out of desktops possibly. But if that's what a school has, then that definitely could be used.
Okay. And here's another kind of question about the activities as well. How do children who do not perform well in the app-based games, how are they motivated to continue without being discouraged? Is there motivation that's brought in, or?
Yeah, so in that sense, there are different levels, and I don't think a child is not necessarily aware of, okay, now you make it to level 3, now you get more things. I think if a child's doesn't do well, it can repeat and get better at that task, and not necessarily feel as though he or she is competing with others. So there's not the same sense of, oh, I'm at level 5 and you're at level 6 that some computer games have.
Okay. And this is another really good question that sort of comes along with a question we had a few minutes ago. Many experts suggest that the frontal lobe does not fully develop until the mid-20s. Do you have information about what level of each executive function skills are typical, normal, average for each age? So like, say, an age range, like 0 to 5, say, here's the skills they should be working on, that kind of thing.
So definitely I agree, and the research does show that even adolescents struggle in many areas of executive function, which probably if you have adolescents or have worked with them, you've probably seen that this idea of impulse control and things like that are still being worked out in teenagers. So in terms of the skills, we can go back into that slide here. So definitely thinking about each skill developing in different ways, and that there can be a typical range, but we also know that the range is extremely wide. So this is part of the challenge that researchers have had in actually assessing executive function and talking about, well, one of the questions asked, what's typical? So especially in this 3 to 6 area, when children are so different in terms of their functioning, that there really is such a broad range in terms of what's typical, that it's hard to say, oh, these are the skills that should be mastered. However, if you do look at some of these slides, then I can send you more information on older ages if you'd like as well. But here, sort of thinking at 4 to 5, for instance, inhibiting, a child can delay eating a treat and can start to hold an arbitrary rule in mind. So say, sort colored cards by shape and not color. So this is something that's developing, and this idea of things that can start to be seen but not necessarily always there, that's very typical of a child at this age.
Wonderful. The next question, and this is kind of that age-old question about screen time. Can screen time inhibit the development of executive function skills?
So that's a good question, and that's a question that's been sort of debated endlessly, at least, and it's thought about a lot in research. So we know that if children are spending all day on screens, so spending, there's some statistics saying something crazy like 6 hours a day on screens or 7 hours a day. I'm not even sure how it's possible, but apparently if children do spend sometimes way, way too much time on screens, and that actually can impact their development of executive function. So we don't want to emphasize children should spend their day or their working hours or playing or waking hours on the screen. I think that would be very, a bad message to get from this. I think that why we do want to emphasize computer training in the sense of a possibility, because it is very short and targeted, and a lot of screen time is screen time that's not really being used well. So I would suggest a lot of time in the outdoors, a lot of time playing with others, and screen time that's actually targeted rather than just simply watching or taking in random TV shows, for example.
Okay. The next question, and this is a fascinating question. Could siblings from the same socioeconomic status, so the same family, be expected to develop similarly in their executive function skills?
So not necessarily. Children, so what we know on a research level is that as a population, children with lower socioeconomic status tend to do worse on measures of executive function. However, there is just a ton of individual variation and variation within families. So children can look very different, even from the same family, in executive function skill development, and that's not necessarily abnormal. So what we really need to think about is that child in the context of peers, that child functioning in a classroom, things like that, rather than saying, oh, his or her brother did this earlier, et cetera, et cetera. If there is a vast difference and it becomes worrisome, then I would definitely bring it up. However, certain variation is definitely to be expected.
Okay, and a somewhat related question to that question is there a relationship between hormone levels and executive function skills in younger children?
That's a good idea. Yeah, I don't know of a lot of research doing hormone studies in younger children. So that would be a really interesting thing to look into, and I can look into that myself as well. I do know that with older children, things like a high level of testosterone, things like that, we know can dampen the ability to inhibit things like that if hormone levels are really out of whack. However, I'd want to look before making a research claim on that in terms of hormone levels.
Okay, and another question we got is, so say you've got a child who needs to work on their executive function skills, and they do, either through Kiko's thinking time or some other therapy approach or other approach. What are some of the transferable things that you might, or results that you might see in an academic setting? Like, say you've got a kindergartner who uses Kiko thinking time or some other program. What might you see in that classroom from that child if they do improve their executive function skills?
Sure. So you might see a difference in multiple areas, and this can look slightly different based on the age of the child and on which skills are actually improving. So, for example, with inhibitory control, a child will be able to potentially wait more for his or her turn, to actually wait for a reward if the teacher says, oh, you'll be doing this fun thing later, to actually be able to wait for that rather than to continually ask or continually have trouble doing the current activity. For something like cognitive flexibility, there's just more of an idea of actually shifting from one task to the next. And this is something that teachers actually ask of students all the time and can be really challenging for some students. So this ability to say, okay, I'm focused on this one task. Now we're going to move to this other thing. And some children do what's called perseverating. So continuing to ask about the old activity, continuing to do the old activity, and having a lot of trouble moving on. And so that can be also something that can improve.
And I can definitely see where good executive function skills, like you said, throughout our lifetime, we need them. So, you know, it's not just young children. So definitely translatable. You know,
and actually,
definitely as we get older, too.
Yeah, we definitely see things like writing, for instance, the ability to write an essay. That obviously needs a ton of executive function skills. So you need to plan, you need to organize your thinking, you need to create a conclusion. So definitely the younger children in terms of the play-based behaviors, but even as we get older, we need them equally for academic skills.
Okay, so we're going to take one or two more questions. We've gotten over 30 questions here today, so this has been really great from everyone. It's been really great.
I'm glad to hear them.
Yeah, it's gotten really good questions. How can we differentiate between ADHD and lower executive function skills? So say you were looking at a typical, say, a 5-year-old, how would you know whether it was ADHD or, you know, his or her executive function skills weren't as good as they could be? Is there a way to differentiate?
Yes, I mean, although that would involve diagnosing or not diagnosing a student with ADD or ADHD. So that's something that really would involve either working with the pediatrician, talking to the parent. So the parent actually has to be actually agreeing to some symptoms or some issues as well, saying that the child has shown deficits in these areas for an ADD diagnosis to be considered. So if some of those things, it's really more of a clinical diagnosis, ADD or ADHD, And if that's ruled out, then you can think about, okay, maybe the child doesn't have ADD or ADHD, but maybe it is simply an executive function challenge. These things are very highly interwoven, though, so it can appear challenging at the start.
Okay, and here's our last question for today, and I'm going to put our slide up, our last slide of the presentation up, and that'll show you how to get more information. You can contact Kiko down at the bottom, sales@kikolabs.com, or you can, look at these websites if you're within the U.S. or in Australia or in Asia, or email us at webinars@scilearn.com, and we can forward your question to them as well. So here's our last question for the webinar today. How can we target these skills during school hours for those students living in low SES situations?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that can happen. So one of them, obviously, we talked about these computerized programs, and that is one way, right? So doing short sessions of those, and that could be in choice time or in other freer times. Other ways are thinking about integrating it throughout the day. So just having opportunities to focus on executive function skills, whether that's through some of these other curricula, drawing ideas from them. It could be through some yoga-based or mindfulness-based practices. And those are things that can actually also work in the classroom in terms of taking a minute simply to recenter the class, to refocus, and to really focus on these skills explicitly. I've also had some success just in my own practice talking about these skills with children explicitly. So not necessarily using all the technical terms, but showing children where the area of the brain is and talking to them about the fact that these are things that we're working on, and really sort of pointing them out when children are doing well with them or when they're struggling with them, and trying to help them as well.
Okay, well that is all we have time for today. We've been presenting for an hour now, so I really appreciate Dr. Rowland for joining us today from Boston, and it's really great to hear your presentation, the amount of detail you gave us. A couple of things I wanted to go over just before we end the session today. You can reach them at those various websites on your screen in front of you, or the email address at the bottom of your screen. You can also email me at webinars@scilearn.com. A couple of things before we end today. Definitely want to hear your thoughts on the survey widget at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to take a few minutes as we're ending the presentation right now to fill that in. It should stay open until until you close it down. Also, I've been asked if you can get the actual PowerPoint slides. I'm going to need to look into that, but you can get a PDF of the presentation, and that's in your resources tab at the bottom of the screen, or you can email me at webinars@scilearn.com, and I will get that information to you as well. Any of the resources are available to you, again, in about an hour and a half or 2 hours from now. The link you use to join the session will be the link you use to get to the recording. We will be emailing everything out to everybody in the next couple of days, so you can also take a look again at the recording and get the resources from the recorded session. So I would like to end here, but again, thank you, Dr. Rowland, for your time today. Really appreciate all of the information you gave us, and hope to see you all again. Yeah, thank you, and we'll hope to see everybody online again. And I'm going to email, I'm actually letting some folks know what my email address is. You can email me at this email address, or you can email me at webinars@scilearn.com. Again, webinars@scilearn.com. And this concludes our presentation for today. So thank you very much.